Hi, I'm Chris, and this is Mahmoud. Mahmoud was a legal resident of the United States until he said something the government didn't like. The government voided his visa without warning and placed him in LaSalle Detention Center in Louisiana. Remember that place that was performing hysterectomies on migrant women? Mahmoud and many more like him are victims of the Trump administration's determination to crush dissent. If the state can arrest you for speaking, are you still free to speak? What happened to free speech? Why is it slipping away so rapidly? Isn't this a democracy? In 1919, in the landmark legal ruling Schenck v. United States, U.S. Supreme Court Judge Oliver Wendell Holmes argued the freedom to speak did not extend to the freedom to falsely shout fire in a crowded theater and thereby drum up panic. With these words, he was telling Americans they didn't have freedom of speech, or that they could say whatever they wanted to, unless someone with more power than them said they couldn't. Because the court's ruling had nothing to do with shouting fire. Holmes used this irrelevant analogy to give the state the power to charge people for handing out pamphlets urging them to resist conscription. These two situations, telling the truth about a war based on lies and yelling fire and thereby unnecessarily stirring up panic in public, are not comparable. If anything, the people handing out pamphlets were correctly identifying a fire and warning others not to go near it. But the ruling set the precedent that the state would decide if any given incident constituted free speech or was just shouting fire and therefore punishable. Free speech protection slowly got stronger after Schenck, but the power to limit speech has always been there, waiting for a government to come along and use it again. In a democracy, or at least a state masquerading as one, free speech means you're allowed to ask politely and quietly for what you want. You won't get it that way, of course. Historically, the way to make change from below in a state society has been to riot and strike, to pose a threat to the interests of the powerful. Having freedom of speech does not on its own lead to any kind of change. But all freedom is connected, so the freer we are to speak, the freer we are to act. We frequently find ourselves in positions where it's disadvantageous to tell the truth, where the incentive is to lie. You might have been told to shut up because you were offering legitimate criticism of something someone considers above criticism. One's favorite political party or candidate can't be criticized just in case the truth hurts their chances of winning power. So if you're a supporter, you might not want to tell an uncomfortable truth, and might even try to silence people who do. Electoral politics ends up limiting our speech to what makes our guy look good and their guy look bad. The truth doesn't die because some blathering, sentient creamsicle comes along and kills it. The truth dies because people don't care about it anymore. If you put aside the truth to promote your political views, you're basically saying you don't care about truth, only power. When your guy takes power, he's not going to care about the truth because he knows you don't and you'll support him whatever he does. If you care about the truth, you'll speak it whoever is in power. But supporting a political party usually just means truth is a weapon for attacking your opponents. People love to shut you up for telling the truth. Just ask this drawing of Socrates with my voice. Everyone says that they believe in the truth, but as soon as I challenge their thinking, I get put to death for heresy and corrupting the youth. That's roughly how Socrates sounded when he spoke English. Many of us have internalized never telling the truth and so lose our respect for it. If your parents and teachers punish you for opening your mouth and others don't listen, what's the point of telling the truth? As we learned from The Boy Who Cried Wolf, the value of the truth and integrity is in warning people of a danger and rallying them to a cause. Whereas speaking truth to power is a waste of time, because power isn't listening. Power is concentrated in institutions like the state by taking away people's freedom. That's why we've never had complete freedom to speak. If you've ever had an argument about free speech, perhaps arguing that we don't have it, perhaps even using Mahmoud as an example, the other person might have countered by saying freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences. It sounds profound, but it's a deflection. as if to say, well, on an existential level, you're free to do anything. Yeah, I'm free to say whatever I want, but I might get fired for it, or police might arrest me for it, or another person might assault me for it. So in effect, I'm not free to say those things. This freedom from consequences cliché in fact reveals the impossibility of complete freedom of speech under the state. It's authoritarians trying to have your cake and eat it too. They're trying to say, you're free, despite this endless list of exceptions. There aren't many places nowadays where I could gather a crowd and say everything I really wanted to say on this channel in public and no police would intervene to stop me. Many people who claim to believe in freedom of speech think the police would be right to stop me, because hardly anyone believes in an absolute right to speak. The dominant belief in a state society is in the inherent rightness of the state to make virtually whatever laws it sees fit, from which it follows that the state should have the power to define the limits of speech. It's one of the many powers states grant themselves. They say when the right to speech applies and when to make an exception. States rarely restrict speech solely for the purpose of protecting vulnerable people. That's just what they claim. That's why the US government now equates all criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism and has made expressions of anti-Semitism illegal. Not real anti-Semitism, of course. They wouldn't want to alienate their base. Just criticism of Israel. This way it can crush all protest against Israel's genocide of Palestine and label it all anti-Semitism, when of course many of the people protesting and getting arrested are Jewish. A lot of people in North America seem to think getting arrested for saying something in public or online only happens in other places. They think other places are police states, but where I'm from is a democracy with rights and freedoms. They're wrong. It's everywhere. Just in the past couple of years, people have been arrested for nonviolent protest in the US, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Israel too. In many of those places, protest, or certain groups that have always protested peacefully, have been outlawed. The UK's Palestine Action has been designated a terrorist organization for symbolic acts of vandalism, and its supporters have been arrested. Because in a nominally free and democratic country, you can't just outlaw all demonstrations, but you can give police excuses to crush dissent. But protesters in the UK are not the only ones targeted for speaking up. Right-wingers regularly decry the relative freedom of speech offered by the university. So that's one of their targets. For years, right-wing Zionists have done their utmost to silence critics of Israel. They keep lists of professors who they label anti-Semitic for daring to question the genocide of Palestine and try to get them fired. These academics thought they had freedom of speech. Students have been arrested and pepper sprayed on college campuses and even denied the degrees they paid and worked for. They were told they had freedom of speech. Journalists who speak out in favor of Palestine get fired too. How many people we don't know about have been punished for publicly disagreeing with mass murder? That's how you criminalize speech and association, but continue to tell people they're free. Now that it has an extreme right-wing authoritarian partner in the White House, Israel and its friends are trying to criminalize telling the truth outright. Speaking of mass murder, climate change is another reason to protest, and to the state, another excuse to fill up the prisons. People have been arrested for climate protests in the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, Australia, pretty much every country I googled with the words arrested at climate protest. By the way, have you noticed it's protest of these issues of mass death that the ruling class is keenest to silence? Can't protest Israel's genocide, we're officially in favor of it. Can't protest huge corporations owning and destroying nature, their shareholders also own the government. So we're not free to speak outdoors. How about at work? Can you say whatever you want at work? We spend half our waking time there, and we can't speak freely. You need to say what people higher up want to hear. First in the interview, and then every day at work. If you complain, you might get disciplined. If you talk about unionizing, you might get fired. I've worked in places where it's against the rules to talk about your salary, because the company doesn't want you to know how bad you're getting screwed. So we can't speak at work, can't speak in public, can't risk getting in trouble for having opinions that go against what our masters approve of. What about social media, like where we are right now? Are we free to speak here? Well, it depends what you want to say. The Tigray genocide was pretty much advertised on Facebook. Moderators were informed that people were fomenting violence and Facebook did nothing. So if you're trying to commit genocide against people in Africa or Asia, yes, you probably do have freedom of speech. Whereas I was suddenly and permanently kicked off Facebook for unspecified reasons. I'm not bitter. Since Elon Musk took over Twitter, Nazis have thrived on the platform. It's normal to see white supremacist rhetoric on there now, sometimes liked and shared by the owner himself. Elon personally kicked a number of left-wing journalists like Chad Loder off Twitter because Nazi sympathizer Andy Ngo requested it. I think these examples represent what free speech means to billionaires who own all the biggest social media. In case the news has overwhelmed you and you stopped watching last November, I regret to inform you the US is rapidly becoming a Christian fascist theocracy. As part of its new manifest destiny, it's been criminalizing indecency. Again, if you have the power to make the law, you get to make the definitions. So many states and school districts have criminalized any expression of being gay or trans in order to continue to lie to children about the existence of gay and trans people. The US is defining everything queer as pornographic and then banning pornography to protect the children. There's always going to be another excuse to limit freedom of choice and freedom of expression and stigmatize whole groups of people. The state is aided in its criminalization of expression by purported free speech organizations. I've been wondering if in US political jargon, freedom and free speech just mean right wing. Fortunately, that's not what it means on this channel. Turning Point USA not only describes itself, but gets described in the corporate media as a free speech organization. Which is absurd. Do these journalists just not know about the professor watch list? TPUSA popularized seizing on something a professor says that goes against right-wing orthodoxy and using it to get them fired. Charlie Kirk got his way in the end because a lot of professors and others were fired and this person arrested for telling the truth about Kirk in the wake of his death. Because they have no free speech. Because most of the people who claim to be free speech activists are authoritarians who make shit up to justify censorship. What about Charlie's amendments? A lot of these self-styled free speech warriors proceeded to dox and send death threats and rape threats to anyone they saw celebrating Charlie Kirk's death. These threats don't get called political violence like killing a fascist propagandist does. I've celebrated Charlie's death. The guy dedicated his life to spreading bigotry and paving the way for everything Trump is doing now. If you're against his killing because you're against political violence, I understand, but I also think we're way past that point and you should catch up. But if you're mourning him, you presumably agree with him and don't sympathize with his victims. If I'm wrong, feel free to tell me why. Jimmy Kimmel obviously had no freedom to speak because he got fired after the FCC threatened ABC because Jimmy made some jokes that were sort of related to Charlie. Guest comedy still isn't legal. Meanwhile, a Fox News host said this week that homeless people should all be killed, and he still has his job. A couple of days after his incredibly cruel remark, someone opened fire on 2 homeless encampments in Minneapolis. But no one is humping Charlie's lifeless corpse harder than the US government, who's using it as a pretext to crack down on all forms of dissent. They're giving themselves the power to take away your citizenship and toss you in a gulag for saying the wrong things. At what point are we allowed to call this a dictatorship? But the free speech warriors don't seem to mind. They only support one kind of speech. That said, to quote 1 dozen rats at a keyboard, I do feel for the dozen or so people who genuinely thought Donald Trump and Republicans cared about free speech. It's gotta be hard having to call your bank 3 to 4 times a year to tell them you fell for the wallet inspector again. So we don't have freedom of speech, but hey, maybe we shouldn't. After all, I can think of some exceptions. People I wouldn't feel right granting that freedom to. How long would you let someone speak if all they were doing was providing reasons why you should be killed? Because millions of people, racialized people, trans people, anyone who doesn't conform to the Aryan ideal, are currently being targeted by millions more people, some of whom are in the White House. Is it wrong to delete the Facebook accounts of people using the platform to commit genocide? Is it wrong to fire a TV host who wants to euthanize the homeless? It's the bare minimum we could ask for. And we still don't get it. Should Nazis have unlimited freedom to say what they want, where they want? The KKK? Some people would say yes, and I would say no. I think if your speech is a lot of bigoted lies, anyone should feel free to stop you. In fact, I would say anything you do to them is self-defense. So does that mean I hate freedom? Actually, I consider it one of the greatest expressions of freedom to stop people who are trying to oppress others. Was it excessive leftist Antifa extremists who stopped Nazi Germany? When you punch a Nazi, the whole world punches with you. But if you're not trying to subjugate whole races and genders, of course you should have the freedom to speak. Let's start with the freedom to talk about salaries and unionizing at work. Or the freedom to speak in public without a permit. The freedom to protest without being recorded and identified and arrested by law enforcement. The freedom to stop a genocide. If the only freedom you have is to beat your fists fruitlessly against an implacable state, you live under tyranny. So if you want a solution, it's to end the tyranny. Any government that's trying to strip people of their citizenship for voicing dissent is tyrannical. And I don't suggest merely changing governments because the next government will have all the same powers and incentives. Tyranny can only end when all involuntary social hierarchy is abolished, when people rise up to tear down the institutions of power and govern themselves. It's possible. It's being done. Subscribe and I'll tell you all about it.